listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot. This episode was recorded in Seoul on the afternoon of Thursday, November 17th, 2022, and my in-studio guest today is John Burzynski, retired from UNCMAC, and we'll be talking about the armistice and violations thereof. But first, please leave a review about this podcast on iTunes or whatever platform you use, and share this episode with colleagues, friends, and even people you don't know. On Spotify, you can leave a rating but no reviews. And on YouTube, you can click like and subscribe. Secondly, check out nknews.org, where you can find lots of in-depth stories written by the journalists who I work with each and every day. And consider buying a subscription for a year. It's much more affordable than you think. In fact, if you sign up for the annual plan, it's less than $1 a day. Thirdly, follow us on Twitter. You can find nknews.org, one word, on Twitter, and myself is JACCOZED or ZED if you must use the American pronunciation. All right, my guest today, to give him a more full introduction, is Mr. John Burzynski. John retired from U.S. government service in September 2020 after working for UNCMAC, and we'll find out more about what that is, for over 20 years as its international relations advisor to the general officers who make up the UNCMAC Commission, as well as the UNC commander. John, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Would you start by telling us about your previous job, and actually walk us briefly through your history and career since 1972, because you've got a long time here on the peninsula, as well as the 20 years that I mentioned as a member of the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission Secretariat.
Sure. I will preface my remarks by saying, number one, I had really no idea what the armistice was. When I first arrived in Korea in 1972, I was a young enlisted man down at Osan Air Base, spent 13 months down there. I returned to Osan in 1981, spent another 3 years as the only engineer assigned to an intelligence organization, and then came back again in 1992, spent a couple of years as an engineer at Osan Air Base, and then moved up to U.S. Forces Korea as the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for the engineers. But in that time, from 1972 through 1994, all of those years, which was almost 10 here in country, I couldn't tell you what UNC or the armistice was. In my time with USFK, there were some incidents that occurred when I was on the engineer staff, and we had to support the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission, UNCMAC, and so that was my first experience. After spending 3 years down on Okinawa, I spent my last 2 years of active duty in the United States Air Force, reassigned to UNCMAC, this time as the International Political Military Affairs Officer. And it was eye-opening, to say the least. And after I retired from the military service, I was fortunate enough that I was hired back as a civilian, as the International Relations Advisor, or IRA, something that most of my British friends don't like to hear.
Right.
But it was quite an adventure. I know you had Steve Began in here. As I recall, he was quoted in Atlantic as saying that he had met the North Koreans 7 times. I've met the North Koreans over 200.
Good gosh.
I stopped counting.
Wow. All right. Well, if we were to go through each of those meetings, that would be quite a number of podcasts. But we'll see how much we can download from your brain today, and then we may have you back for a second episode later on.
Sure.
So I understand that you began your work at UNCMAC as the International Relations Advisor in June 2000, or more or less around the time of the Kim Dae-jung, Kim Jong-il summit. Is that right?
That is correct. I was fortunate enough that I arrived in country 5 days before that summit. I had been following it from down in Okinawa through the media, and so I felt very fortunate to be here in country when that happened.
Okay. So now today we're going to focus a lot on the Armistice Agreement and violations and alleged violations thereof. It's very much a hot topic here on NK News the last month or two. So could you give us a brief overview of the Armistice Agreement, and especially how that applies to the 3 zones of land, air, and sea?
Sure. The Armistice Agreement, first and foremost, it's a ceasefire agreement, and it is a military agreement, as you know, signed by 3 military commanders. It is applicable to both military and civilians when you look at areas such as the demilitarized zone. There are some who question whether the United Nations Command has any authorities over civilians in a demilitarized zone. And I believe that that's a misinterpretation of the preamble of the armistice, which says that this is it is written on military matters. But I believe that was placed there to distinguish between military matters and diplomatic matters, because you recall that later when you look at it, probably paragraph 62 or 63 of the agreement talks about having a conference within 3 months on the diplomatic and political through diplomatic and political channels to resolve the issue. So the agreement was essentially intended to last 90 days, maybe a year on the outside, and we're approaching 70 years now.
Yeah, I guess as a comparison, there was the armistice that ended World War I, which came into effect on the 11th of November, and then they had the whole Conference of Versailles to work out the peace treaty between all the nations of Western Europe, and that took a year or so, and then after that, the armistice was no longer necessary because you had a formalized peace treaty.
Exactly, and that was the goal, the initial goal for those who framed the armistice.
And this armistice, of course, was the result of the 2 and a bit years of negotiations, first at Kherson and later at Panmunjom.
That is correct. The beginning of the armistice covers the various domains, the applicability. It established the demilitarized zone. Yep. It established the military demarcation line as a line through the middle of the demilitarized zone, essentially saying first, here's the military demarcation line, and then pull back 2,000 meters on either side, and that establishes the DMZ. In addition to that, the armistice talks about that the forces on either side will respect the land that is under the control of the opposing side. Now, you have to take into consideration at the time the armistice was being negotiated too, that the North Koreans essentially had no navy. North Koreans had no air force. The Allies had air supremacy. And so the paragraphs that cover those two domains, the sea and the air, are almost vague.
Right.
But it was probably, again, with the intent that this is only going to last for a short time, so it really doesnn't matter very much.
90 days to a year, as you said.
Exactly.
Right.
In the sea domain, the one exception is that there is a subparagraph that outlines specifically that the 5 island groups, the Northwest Islands,
Pyongyang-do, Yeonpyeong-do, and the other 3.
That's right. That those would remain under the control of the Commander United Nations Command. Essentially, the Commander United Nations Command had control of all the islands.
Right.
And he essentially ceded control over all but those 5.
Ceded control to
the north.
To the north. Oh, I see. Except for those 5.
Right.
Right. So you say that so in the armistice agreement, because of the lack of air and sea power held by North Korea at the time of the signing of the armistice, there really isn't much about air and sea.
That's right. Essentially, it says that you will not, for example, with the air, you will not operate the aircraft over the demilitarized zone, and you will respect the air over the land spaces under the control of the opposing commander. Right. I.e., you will not fly into North Korea if you were coming out of the rock. Right. And the same thing applies essentially in the sea. And of course, now we have that little asterisk and the idea of having the NLL, the Northern Limit Line, established.
Yeah. Let me come to that in a second. I want to go back. So the MDL, the military demarcation line, is that more or less the same as what was the line of control or the line of contact between the opposing forces on July 27, 1953?
Essentially, yes.
Okay, so that wherever your soldiers are, draw back 2,000 meters,
right,
and that will be the southern and northern limits of the demilitarized zone.
That's correct. And the armistice specified that the military demarcation line would be marked so that both sides knew where it was.
Right.
So the forces went out and put stakes in the ground, 1,292, stretching from the west coast, from the Han River estuary, all the way out to the East Sea.
Right. These are the yellow markers?
The ones with the yellow signs on there in English, and Hangul facing to the south, and Hangul in Chinese facing to the north.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that three parties signed the armistice agreement. Who signed it and who refused to sign?
Well, let me start with the beginning. Who signed it? Kim Il-sung signed. Kim Il-sung signed as the supreme commander of the North Korean People's Army. Peng Dehuai signed as the commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers. And then it's Mark Clark. General Mark Clark signed. It was General Harrison that who went to Panmunjom and did the counter signing, because there were 5 signatures at the end of the armistice agreement. The 3 principal commanders, who really that's who it applies to, and they assume the responsibilities by signing for it. And then Nam Il, representing North Korea and the CPV, the Chinese People's Volunteers, and General William Harrison co-signed as they exchanged those 18 copies of the armistice agreement up in Panmunjom.
Now, who didn't sign?
Well, let me add one footnote on the signatories,
Yes.
and then I'll address that who didn't sign. When General Clark signed on behalf of the United Nations Command and the countries that provided forces during the conflict. So thus, not only was he signing for the United States of America, but also the other countries that provided the combat forces and
Right.
medical support, and the Republic of Korea. Now, that's the sticking point always.
Yeah.
Sigmund Rhee did
Right.
not want to sign the armistice agreement, but he relented at the very end. He was able to use that as leverage to get financial support he needed for the country for rebuilding anyway, and then finally conceded. But his opinion was that they should fight till the last man standing.
To try to unify the country.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, the Chinese People's Volunteers, that's distinguished from the People's Liberation Army of the People's Republic of China. What's going on there?
That's interesting. The Chinese People's Volunteers probably had some volunteers. And then there were, and I would probably assume that amongst those were some who felt that they had just finished the civil war in China.
Yeah.
They did not want to stay on the mainland, and they were looking for a way to exit. And so one course of action was then to join this group, fight in Korea. Many of them were captured here, and in fact, the Republic of Korea transferred and transported a large number of them to Taiwan after the armistice was signed. There, I'm sure, were some regulars, but it's hard to say. A lot of confusion, and depending on who you read and what you read, who was flying which jets over North Korea, and who was as part of the ground forces there also.
Is there a direct line of control between the Chinese People's Volunteers and the People's Liberation Army?
Not that I'm aware of. In fact, years ago, you're well aware that now the Republic of Korea is doing a lot of excavation for Korean War remains.
Right.
And they do find Chinese remains.
Right.
And these days, they've been sending those back usually once a year in the spring, about March or April they do it. And the number was large, the number that was on hand. In probably the early 2000s, we, the United Nations Command, before the Republic of Korea started getting into this, we tried to return some of those remains to the Chinese. And we spoke to the North Koreans in Panmunjom, hoping that they would be our conduit in. After several meetings, they finally got sick of listening to us and said, go find the Chinese and talk to them instead.
Oh.
So we did.
Yeah.
And we spoke with the Chinese defense attaché at the time here in Seoul.
Yeah.
And the first meeting we had with him, he was quite positive. He said, well, we want to follow the armistice agreement.
Right.
And we took that as a positive sign. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, we met for dinner again and more discussion. And at that time, he told us that he could not. He said those remains are Chinese People's Volunteers and I'm People's Liberation Army. You have to find the Chinese People's Volunteers.
Did they have an office or a P.O. box?
Nothing.
An email? Nothing.
No,
Okay,
no.
Gosh. Now, does the fact that Syngman Rhee refused to sign the armistice make it any less valid or legitimate?
I don't think so. Again, the fact that it was signed by General Clark on behalf of all the combatants on our side, I think, added the validity to it. And I don't think that the Republic of Korea had initially had difficulty with it because it helped with the security of this country.
The Chinese People's Volunteers removed themselves from UNCMAC in 1992, and North Korea stopped attending meetings. Does that do anything to the validity of the agreement?
It doesn't do anything to the validity of the agreement, but it does make it difficult to continue to implement the agreement. Although I will tell you that from some of the old-timers that I spoke to who were on the Military Armistice Commission back in the early 90s and had met in some of those meetings with the Chinese the Chinese were not contributors. They sat at the table. Sometimes they slept at the table. Sometimes they didn't even have the KPA leads talking points, so that made it difficult.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Now, almost 10 years ago, in March 2013, the government in Pyongyang declared the armistice agreement itself to be null and void and invalid. What effect did this have?
None. What they did in 2013 was one of probably at least 10 occasions when they disavowed the armistice agreement. However, when you look at it, first of all, the armistice agreement has a paragraph in there that says that the agreement can be terminated or it can be amended with mutual consent from the opposing sides. So that's number one.
Right. So it's only invalid if everybody agrees that it's invalid.
Exactly.
And if only North Korea says it's invalid, that doesn't mean anything.
Exactly. And number two, a point that I've always stuck with is go to Panmunjom on a tour and try to step across the military demarcation line. The North Koreans will honor that military demarcation line. They honor the demilitarized zone. So in my estimation, I have always termed their participation in the armistice agreement to be selective implementation of the agreement. When it meets their needs, then they do.
Can you help me understand the distinction between the United Nations Command and the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission? Are they the same thing or are they two different bodies?
They are two different bodies, with the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission answering to the United Nations Command. The UNCMAC on our side represents the UNC commander. The UNC was established by the UN Security Council resolutions 82, 83, 84, and 85 from 1950 at the beginning of the conflict. The Military Armistice Commission wasn't established until the armistice, and it was established as part of the armistice. One of the mechanisms in order to implement the armistice and to maintain it and to control it. So it's not only the MAC, the Military Armistice Commission, but also the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, Switzerland, Sweden, and originally Poland and Czechoslovakia, and then the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission, the only one of the three commissions that completed their mission and was then disestablished.
Is there an equivalent of, or was there an equivalent of UNCMAC on the other side of the demilitarized zone, one that involved the Chinese People's Volunteers and North Korea?
That's correct. They were originally, if you will, the KPA MAC, Korean People's Army MAC. In the early 2000s, I guess it was, when they were going through one of those throes of or disavowing the armistice agreement, they said, we are no longer the KPA MAC, and we are now the KPA Panmunjom mission. So changed their name,
Uh-huh.
but for, it was the same friendly faces we saw the next day, the next meeting.
Right. Now, okay, so, but as you said there, the UNC, the United Nations Command, was something that was created by the United Nations Security Council resolutions in 1950, but authority to run the UNC was handed over to the United States military. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, the United States functions as the executive agent. When you look at the at those Security Council resolutions, Resolution 84 says that the United States will establish a, quote, unified command, which will accept the offers of assistance from other countries. Resolutions 82, 83, and then again 84 all said, if you're a UNC or UN member, help South Korea. When you're giving those military assistance, do it through this unified command. Thus, the United States of America was the executive agent for the United Nations Command. And because the words in the Security Council resolution were unified command, they used that term to be the United Nations Command.
Right. Now, so when you go to Panmunjom on a tour, you see the UN flags everywhere, but it's actually the U.S. military running the show.
Well, it's a combination of the U.S. and the Republic of Korea military.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, but the UN, in practical terms, the UN doesn't really have an involvement on a daily basis with what's going on up there.
That is correct.
And they don't fund it. It's not run or funded by the UN.
That's correct. The United Nations Command, the initial mission, when you look at the Security Council resolutions, was to establish the international peace and security to the region. So they were the combatant command during the war.
Right.
And as you know, the ROC U.S. Combined Forces Command that was established in 1978, then the combatant command duties were transferred from the United Nations Command to CFC.
Combined Forces Command, okay.
However, there is in the agreement that established CFC a premise in there that the commander of CFC will support the commander UNC in his armistice-related duties as necessary.
Okay, inasmuch as the UNC is the combatant command and the Military Armistice Commission is about maintaining the armistice, is there ever a time when those two bodies are at odds?
No, not today.
Okay.
And that is, I think, because we have that distinction with CFC and not UNC. UNC now, and General Brooks probably mentioned this to you, is now a supporting command. It's supporting both the Republic of Korea military and the Combined Forces Command. So it would provide materials and forces as necessary should a conflict re-arise.
Right.
Now, is there a conflict between those who implement and administer the armistice and the operators, the military operators? Periodically there is. But we have programs in place. The UNCMAC has an education program that's been going on for quite a few years now, specifically for the demilitarized zone and the Northwest Islands, where we have people who go out and remind the troops out there what the armistice agreement is, how it applies to them in their sector of the DMZ, for example.
Okay, and that's both Korean and non-Korean troops.
That's correct.
Receive such education.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. The 16 sending nations?
Well, there were 16 that provided combat forces, and then 5 additional that provided medical support.
So in what ways are they still involved in UNCMAC? Because sometimes up there you might meet I've met a New Zealand officer there on a tour and Canadian officers. So in what way are they still organized in UNC and in UNCMAC? Yeah,
well, it's there's 2 parts to that. Starting back in about 2003, several of the UNC member states, the UK and New Zealand specifically, contributed some troops to the UNCMAC for specific duties. Back in 2003, we had the 50th anniversary of the signing of the armistice, and the commemoration ceremony that took place up in Panmunjom needed a lot of support help.
Okay.
And so the other countries augmented the U.S. members of the UNCMAC staff to put that together. Now, since then, especially probably after General Scaparrotti was the commander of United Nations Command, a number of the countries have answered the call to provide members to the UNC staff. And so General Abrams has talked about this before too. It's a limited staff with a limited number, but these are people who are planners now. As I said, UNC is a supporting command, but they need to know what to support. They need to know how it will be supported, and they need to know who will support it. So countries making offers of assistance, that group, which is composed of U.S., ROC planners, and then also UNC planners. So there's a separate UNC staff that operates to help support CFC and USFK if necessary too.
How have the attitudes of both North Korea and South Korea towards the armistice agreement and also their abiding by it changed over time?
Well, it fluctuates with time. And I can't tell you that there's any particular stimulus that makes it happen. But there were times when we saw a number of provocations by the KPA. And when we saw those provocations, some of the response that was coming from the ROC military was in conflict with provisions of the armistice agreement.
What would constitute a provocation? Would that be an example, be shooting across? What would be the lowest level provocation you could think of?
Probably bringing weapons, crew-served weapons, into the demilitarized zone.
Crew-served weapons?
For example, a tank.
Oh, I see.
You don't bring a tank. You don't bring an armored personnel carrier. You don't bring those kinds of large mortar where it takes more than one person. For the demilitarized zone, it's intended that yes, there are soldiers there, but they have their personal protective weapons.
So a gun?
Yes.
Okay. But shooting a gun would that be a provocation?
It would be both. It would be a provocation, and it could be an armistice agreement. An armistice violation, depending on where the shot landed.
What about throwing a rock?
Well, if you throw a rock at somebody from the opposing side, then that would be a provocation. Okay. It could be an armistice because the armistice says both sides should not take hostile actions toward the other side.
So how is the armistice agreement enforced, and who enforces it?
Well, if an incident occurs, the UNCMAC usually puts together a special investigative team, and they go out to investigate the matter. Originally, under the armistice agreement provided for joint observer teams. The joint being from the North Korean Chinese side and from the UNC side. And they would go out and jointly investigate the matter.
Right.
As a prelude to that, usually, each side would send out its own troops to the site of the incident, investigate it, and then come back and then do the joint investigation, then follow it up with a MAC meeting at the general officer level where they would discuss the results of what they found. Usually diametrically opposed. But now, because the North Koreans refuse to participate in the joint observer teams, and we've approached them at times for major incidents, for example, the sinking of the Chonan, the other major incidents, and said, hey, let's form a joint observer team, and they weren't willing to do that. So it's done by special investigative teams that go out, investigate it, and then they report that not only to the UNC commander, but it's also available to the North Korean side. Under the armistice agreement, when it comes to violations, each side is supposed to report violations to both commanders. So in days when we were meeting more frequently, we would have meetings in Panmunjom, and we would bring forth what evidence we had to document that an armistice violation had occurred.
Theoretically, how are armistice violations supposed to be dealt with? Are there any scope for sanctions or punitive measures?
The armistice agreement says that the commanders should punish those on their side who commit violations of the Armistice Agreement.
Right.
But I can't say that we've ever witnessed that.
So I guess as an example, as a practical example, the Panmunjom axe murder incident of 1975.
Six,
thank you. I always get that year wrong. How should that have been dealt with in accordance with the Armistice Agreement?
Well, in accordance with the Armistice Agreement, then the two sides should have had that joint observer team get together.
Right, so going to the site of where it happened.
And then looking at everything that happened, interviewing everybody who was involved in it.
Yes.
And then having the Military Armistice Commission meeting with both sides represented.
At the general officer
level. At the general officer level,
right.
and then discussing it and resolving to take action. Now, there were meetings after the axe murders, and as a result, that's when you had that division up in Panmunjom, and it was you stay on your side and we will stay on our side. The security forces were not allowed to freely cross the MDL any longer.
Right, and they put that raised little concrete footpath on the MDL in Panmunjom.
Yeah, and the MDL had been marked in Panmunjom already anyway. There's some white stakes in Panmunjom that show that, yeah.
Okay, but now there was like a little raised and
between the
everyone
buildings.
Understood you can't go beyond this unless you're repairing a building.
Right.
Because that's something that I always wonder about is how, because those buildings have been there for a long time. Obviously, there's repair work. You've got to clean the gutters. You've got to put on a new roof. How does that work in practice? You know, if the UN wants to fix their building, do they, announce to North Korea, we're going to go in on this and this day and cross the line and fix the building with some workers, and then North Korea says, okay, how does that actually work?
We negotiate that.
Okay.
As you know, there were two different colors of buildings up there.
Blue and silver.
The blue and silver. Yeah. One is the blue buildings that the UNC is responsible for. We put together our plan. Mm-hmm. We ask for a meeting. And then we present our plan. And then we talk to the other side and seek their cooperation for painting the buildings, because they need that every once in a while. And as you said, roofs and fixing broken things. Yeah. Most of the time, it's fairly easy. They accommodate us. They understand that. It's normal maintenance. And vice versa. If there was a reason that they needed to come to our side, they've done that too.
Okay, so I got sidetracked for a moment. So to go back to the 1976 Panmunjom axe murder incident, so what was the result of the general officers' meetings that were held after the investigation?
Well, it was that separation.
Oh, I see.
It specifically said that the security forces, before August 18th of 1976, the security forces could freely roam around anywhere in the joint security area. So our forces could go up to Pamungak and the buildings behind it and vice versa. After 76, no longer.
Okay. But were there any punitive measures or sanctions on the North Koreans who did the beatings that led to the deaths of Barrett and
Boniface?
Boniface, thank you.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. But in theory, under the armistice, they should have been punished by their own side for doing what they did.
Exactly.
There's a story that I heard, I don't know if this is true or not, that Barrett and Boniface, although armed, did not use their revolvers to protect themselves because they thought that might have been a violation of the armistice. Am I getting that wrong?
I think it could have been. I think it's more from what I've heard.
Yeah.
They did not want to draw their weapons, their sidearms, in order not to have the situation escalate.
Okay.
Yeah, and that big difference there, I think.
No, you're right. Yep. Yeah, but ultimately, that they were beaten to death with those axe handles, and that's a very very sad end.
Yes, until that time, that was a fairly common practice. If you talk to some of the soldiers who were assigned up in Panmunjom during that period of time, it wasn't uncommon that the soldiers were carrying clubs, if you will, and there were skirmishes from time to time.
Is that because clubs are not technically covered by the armistice?
No, I guess I'd have to speculate as to why they did that.
So my understanding is that these days, after an alleged violation occurs, investigations are carried out by the UNCMAC side together with the NNSC. Reports are written. They're left in the mailbox of the North Koreans to pick up, and that's pretty much the end of it. Is that more or less right?
Yes, with a couple of notable exceptions.
Okay.
and those are the sinking of the Chonan and the artillery attack on Waipido.
Right.
General Sharp was the commander of UNC at the time, and General Sharp directed that those special investigative reports, when they were done, would be sent to the United Nations Security Council. And so they follow through channels, so they had to go up through U.S. military channels and then over to the U.S. State Department. But the U.S. representative at the UNC presented them at a Security Council meeting. And if you look through the list of Security Council meetings, they're in there. One is 608, and I don't remember the number of the other one, but they're there.
Yeah, but both incidents took place in 2010, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
But the General Sharp specifically wanted to be sure that this was not a case of that a major incident occurred and it would not be recognized internationally. So he wanted to put those marks on the wall for all to see.
Instead of just filing it and forgetting it, he wanted to escalate it to the UN Security Council level to make sure that it was all discussed.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, violations can take place on land. We've talked about a couple of those, such as crossing the demilitarized zone into the other side. Spy missions would be an example of that too. And then there's sea and air violations. We've been writing a lot about them here at NK News, about sea and air violations. Before we go on, you mentioned the NLL earlier in the interview, and it's an issue that seems to trip me and others up a lot. So what is the NLL? When was it put into place? Because I don't think it's in the armistice. And what is it actually intended to do? Okay. And how does it work?
The Northern Limit Line was established by the commander of United Nations Command, and it was established, and he established it as a control measure to restrain forces on our side, both naval and air forces, from venturing too close to the North Korean mainland, particularly in the West Sea, in the Yellow Sea, where the separation is very small.
Okay, so it wasn't put in place to stop North Koreans coming south, but to stop mainly South Koreans from possibly going too far north.
South Koreans and U.S. forces, that's correct.
Ships and planes.
Ships and planes, right.
Right. But was that sometime after the armistice? Because it's not actually in the armistice, is it?
That's correct. The armistice talks about contiguous waters and respecting the waters that are under your control. And when you look at those islands out there in the west,
the 5 West Sea Islands,
the area that would be considered under the control, using the terminology from 1953 of territorial waters, is 3 nautical miles off the shores.
Yes.
Okay. So this changed the area so that there were areas where you would not necessarily go. The Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense used to publish a brochure that says the NLL was established in August 30th of 1953.
So shortly after the signing of the armistice.
Shortly after the signing of the armistice. Mm-hmm. But no one that I'm aware of has been able to find the document. There are some references to some naval operational orders, particularly within the ROC military forces. But that date of 30 August 53 is a bit of conjecture.
Gosh.
There's an academic, Dr. Rohrig, who's at the Naval Research Center in Newport, Rhode Island. Yeah. And he has researched this extensively and just can't find it.
So what's the earliest recorded date that we have got?
Well, it's probably that August 30th, because we're not sure we can find anything else right now.
Okay, so that'll work for now, but
it works
it's not
for
in
now.
the armistice.
Yeah. And when you look at it, the way it was set up, in cases where you looked at the North Korean mainland and the islands, the line is such that it splits the difference where that's possible. Mm-hmm. But that's not always possible. And point in case, if you look at Yeonpyeong-do,
right.
The NLL is inside the ROC territorial waters, inside 3 nautical miles, because if you take 3 nautical miles from either side, there's not 6 nautical miles between the north shore of Yeonpyeong-do and North Korea.
Yeah.
And then as far as the how far does the NLL stretch, I would venture that you can't say it goes any more than territorial waters.
And how far is that again? 3 nautical miles.
Around the islands.
Okay.
Around the rest of Korea, it is the now current standard of 12 nautical miles. So if you applied that, then in my opinion, the NLL in the West Sea extends out 12 nautical miles west of Pyongyang.
Pyongyang.
Right.
In the direction of China.
In the direction of China.
Okay.
So that if you take a look at that incident that occurred recently with the Chinese merchant vessel and the firing on that merchant vessel, I think it's difficult to argue that took place in ROC territorial waters.
Because it was beyond the 12.
Because it was beyond the 12. From what I saw, the data that I saw, just the distance was farther out.
Yeah.
I would think that there are some who interpret it, when you look at the West Sea, to say that the NLL goes out to the 124 East line, which is that latitude that really divides the waters in the West Sea that are China versus Korean Peninsula. So it's how the two sides operate. When you go out the East Sea, the Sea of Japan, I would say that the same interpretation applies.
So 12 miles, nautical miles.
Right. So now if you look at the missile that was fired and where it impacted.
Wait, which one?
Well,
there's been a lot of them.
There was one that it impacted northeast of Ulleung-do.
Oh, okay, yeah, yep.
And one of the media reports I read said it landed in South Korean territorial waters.
Yes, did it?
I don't know, but again, just from media reports, the distance from Ulleung-do was 100 nautical miles or more. So I would say, it's questionable. It could have been international waters.
It could have been, okay. So you really need to see it on a map or a satellite to know exactly.
Exactly,
Once it's beyond those 12 nautical miles, you can't say that's South Korean territorial water anymore.
Right. I think you'll find some that will argue the opposite. Right. But that's been my interpretation. And in my 20 years in UNCMAC, that was the interpretation that we applied.
Now, we have a problem, I guess, in as much as neither the NLL nor the demilitarized zone are national borders. Right? They're not borders between two nation states. They're not borders between two countries because, of course, North Korea and South Korea don't recognize each other. They claim jurisdiction over the whole of the Korean Peninsula. So what status do these lines have in international law?
They don't have any status. I think there are some maps that show the NLL, particularly those in the West Sea, the Yellow Sea, but that's all. When it comes to the negotiations, the armistice, as we talked about earlier, specified the islands, and it specified waters contiguous to. So again, you go out 3 nautical miles. Once you get beyond that, whose waters are they?
Right.
From a North Korean perspective, that is their point of conjecture, that you can't say that anything south of the NLL is yours. The waters, not the islands. They haven't disputed the islands. You recall that back in early 90s, probably, they had come up with their military maritime demarcation line.
Right.
Which was different than the NLL, significantly farther to the south.
Right, but with 5 northward stretching fingers to cover the 5 islands.
The routes up to the islands, exactly.
Very narrow fingers.
Yeah, but their point was that the waters are not ROC territorial waters; they're somebody's.
Well, they said there's they may not be ours, but the.
The point is that I think if I were in North Korea, I'd be using this to try to argue, hey, we need to sit down and negotiate this and make a determination on who owns how much water out there.
And isn't that something that President Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Jong-il tried to do at their summit in 2007?
They did that. They tried to. They were unsuccessful, and my understanding was that President Roh Moo-hyun had a lot of pushback from here in South Korea on giving up the NLL.
Right.
The other thing that they tried to do was to establish those joint fishing zones out there, and that unfortunately just didn't grab hold either.
Right. Just to wrap up the NLL part there, when did North Korea start raising objections to the NLL?
To the best of my knowledge, it was probably in the mid-1970s after the U.S. Navy stopped patrolling in the West Sea and transferred that mission to the ROC Navy.
So once the North Korean naval vessels were coming up against or meeting or seeing ROC naval vessels, that became a point of contention.
You'd have to make that assumption, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about violations of the armistice. Can you tell us about some historical sea and air violations and how they were dealt with?
Okay. Well, the banner violations obviously are the sinking of Jamsuri 357.
Right. That's also known as the 2002 First Battle of Yeonpyeong-do.
Second battle.
Beg your pardon. The second. Yeah, you're right.
98
was right. The second battle of Yeonpyeong-do in 2002 during the World Cup.
That's right. That's right. While Kim Dae-jung was in Tokyo. The sinking of the Chonan and the shelling of Waipido. And even if you go back a little farther on sea incidents, back in the mid-90s, the submarines, the infiltration submarines that ended up beached in Sokcho also were sea-type violations.
Right.
Yeah. In all of those cases, I mean, there were investigations that took place. As I mentioned earlier, for the sinking of the Chonan and the Waipido shelling, those reports went all the way to the Security Council. There were meetings on the submarines that beached off on the East Coast. At first, the North Koreans, I understand, denied that they had any affiliation with that. But then later, when the Republic of Korea offered to return the remains of the sailors that were found on the ship or on the submarine, they were willing to take those remains back.
There was some statement of regret, I think, from Kim Il-sung, something like that.
Right, yeah.
Right. Now, you also, what about the, I understand there was a placing of fishing barricades in the West Sea, but I don't know anything about that. Can you tell us about that?
Back in, I'm going to stretch my imagination here, I guess I have to say maybe about 2016 or so, when there were the fishermen out in the West Sea were being plagued by South Korean fishermen.
Okay.
It was our understanding that the DPRK licensed some Chinese fishing vessels to fish essentially north of the NLL. And of course, some of them ventured south of the NLL periodically.
Right.
But the method of fishing was significantly different than what both the North Koreans and the South Koreans were doing. And the Chinese, I understand, are using these drag nets across, and so they're just picking up everything.
Everything, yeah.
And that's causing a problem out there, and they're depleting the resource, obviously. Right. So the ROC government, trying to protect the areas, designated some areas that are close to the NLL, but still within the ROC territorial waters. And they put out two different types of structures in there. They had one that was kind of a big concrete structure with holes in it.
Under the water.
And they dropped that under the water.
Yeah.
And this creates an artificial reef.
Yeah.
And then it helps build up the habitat for the fish.
Right.
The others were kind of a rebar type structure, kind of the barricade that you would see, but a very large one.
Right.
And these steel barricades were put in some of those locations also. If you drag your net across,
that would wreak havoc with the net.
It would snare the net, probably rip the net, and that would prevent the Chinese from taking advantage of those areas.
Yeah.
Now, because of the location that the ROC government wanted to do that, General Brooks insisted that there needed to be UNC involvement in that, because it was taking place in ROC territorial waters, which by the definition essentially were waters that are under his control as the UNC commander.
Right.
So when these operations took place and the contractors went out to do this, the ROC Navy had some security vessels out there, but We also had people from UNCMAC who were either on a ROC naval vessel or later at the Second ROC Fleet headquarters in Pyongyang and monitored the situation out there to be sure that first on our side, nobody accidentally strayed across north of the NLL, which did not happen, and that you didn't have any counter reaction from the other side. And again, that didn't happen. Usually with these kinds of things, and with the sinking of Jamsudi 357, the first day of the recovery operation, the North Koreans sent some vessels down. They looked at what was going on out there. They turned around, went back, and didn't come back again for the rest of the recovery operation. Although prior to the operation taking place, they insisted to us in Panmunjom that we had to have their security guarantees before we began the operation, which we refused to accept. We said, no, you sunk our vessel out there. It's in waters that are under our control, and we're going to do this, and we did it.
Procedurally, what would that look like, a security guarantee from North Korea? Is that in the form of a note, or just they just say it?
I suspect that it would be more say it than a note. They don't like to put things in writing if they can afford not to.
Okay, so they could have just said it, and then you just go ahead and do it.
That's right. Or to try to prevent the thing from ever happening, they could drag this on for forever too.
Meeting after meeting.
Meeting after meeting after meeting.
Can you think of a situation where that happened?
I can think of a mundane situation where that happened. You've been to Panmunjom.
Yes.
You stand on our side and you look at the raised concrete, and our side has a bunch of pea gravel on there.
Yeah.
And you look on the North Korean side, north of the marker, and it's sand with weeds growing out of it.
Right.
For the 50th anniversary of commemorating the signing of the Armistice Agreement, we had developed a plan to put that pea gravel all around all the buildings for vegetation control.
Yes.
And we started, and we went up to the North Korean side and with a dump truck and a front end loader, and they took one dump truck full or two dump trucks full of sand out of there so that we could be prepared to put down the pea gravel. The North Koreans balked at it, said, "What are you doing? We didn't give you permission to do that." Stopped the operation, and we went for several weeks where we were meeting, and the only thing they would tell us in the conference room is, "We want our sand back."
Did they get it back?
They got sand back.
In trucks?
We delivered sand to them in trucks, yes.
And did they take it?
Yeah, they were unloaded on their side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that you never got the gravel around the...
But then their argument was that if their soldiers stood on the gravel, it would hurt their feet.
Hurt their feet, yeah. Well, perhaps. I've not looked at the soles of North Korean military boots. Now, what about air violations? I can think of at least one, of course, famously in December 1994, a USFK helicopter went into the demilitarized zone and was shot down. So tell us about that.
Yeah, there have been a few. The number of air violations is infrequent. Thank goodness for that.
Right.
The 1994 incident was, I think, could be easily labeled an accident. It happened in December. It happened the day after a recent snowfall. If you're in a helicopter and you look down, it was looking at a sheet of white paper on a desk.
You wouldn't see the markers. You wouldn't see where the line is.
There were no markers at the time, so there was nothing out there. And you wouldn't be able to distinguish the terrain. That's why when the crew of the helicopter found that, they presumed that they had been in the wrong place, and they started to come down as their procedures warranted. That's when the North Koreans came out and fired on them, and they took a hard landing, which unfortunately killed the co-pilot, and the pilot was held for about 10 days in North Korea. And the UNC, there was a lot of study that went on. When you take a look at that time period, 1994, when you look at animation now and fly-throughs and things like that, these things were just at the onset in 1994.
Sure, yeah.
And I was fortunate or unfortunate that in my job with the USFK engineers, that we had a special unit assigned to us that was doing that braking technology with the U.S. Army. And they were able to put together something that they could take to then Commander General Gary Luck, and to show him how this happened and essentially where it happened. And then there was a MAC meeting. The senior member of the MAC back then was a U.S. naval officer. He happened to be on leave off Peninsula because this was right around Christmas time.
Right.
So the then J5, the Marine, was then directed that he had to go to Panmunjom at the MAC meeting to apologize to the North for this transgression, and then said that, we will do our best to make sure this doesn't happen again.
So the flying into the demilitarized zone, that's, as you say, an accidental violation by the U.S. side of the Armistice Agreement. Was the firing on the helicopter by North Korea also a violation of the agreement, or are they technically allowed to do that if they're responding to a violation?
That's an interesting question. The fact that it took place in North Korea, as far as I know, and I may be wrong, but as far as I know, it took place at a location that was north of the DMZ.
Ah, okay. So not only did the helicopter fly across the southern boundary of the demilitarized zone, it flew over the military demarcation line and out the other side over the northern boundary line of
That's my understanding.
Okay.
So
in that case,
then it would probably be different. Yeah,
that's not even covered by the armistice,
right?
Because you're in North Korean territory. Yeah.
But things have changed. A few years ago, during I guess it was the fall dry season, a lot of brush fires. There's always brush fires, and sure, especially out in the east part of the country, as you know.
Yeah.
And so the ROC government has firefighting helicopters that they put out, and they use those particularly in the mountainous areas because that's the only way you can get in there to extinguish these fires.
Yeah.
And we had a firefighting helicopter that accidentally flew across the DMZ also. The pilot was fixated on the smoke he saw. He knew he was going up to put out a fire, and when he saw this smoke, that's right where he went to dump his water. Now there is a system in place to where they can contact him with voice communications and tell him that he's entered the DMZ. You have to turn around and come back. But by the time he received that communication, it was already too late.
Oh.
But he turned around and came back. We did an investigation, and then in Panmunjom, we told the North Koreans what had happened, that it was all accidental. I think they understood that, too. There's, I think, unlike in the early days after the armistice was first signed, there's a bit more pragmatism at times that, okay, things can happen. And so, you have to take some of these things with a grain of salt. On the other hand, you recall the UAVs that the North Koreans flew into the Republic of Korea.
Some drones to take photos of the Blue House and things. Yeah.
And these, I mean, you're talking about flying across the DMZ and flying into the territory on this side.
Right.
We protested those to the other side.
Yeah.
But those are distinct air violations also.
Although drones, of course, not literally covered by the armistice, but any activity that includes flying south of the demilitarized zone would be.
First of all, the armistice says don't fly over the DMZ. So operating that vehicle over the air vehicle over the DMZ would be a violation. Secondly, there's a subsequent agreement to the Armistice Agreement that says that surveillance aircraft, and the drones are surveillance aircraft, those fall into that category so that those aren't supposed to be flown in that area also.
What about what's that, the U.S. spy plane, the U-2 that flew really high?
Right.
Would that have been covered by that agreement too?
Well, to the best of my understanding, the U-2 never overflew the North Korea.
Okay. Let's talk about some criticisms of the Armistice Agreement. There are people in South Korea who criticize the Armistice Agreement. You've been a student of it for a long time. What criticisms are commonly made, and to what extent are they valid or have merit?
Well, I guess there is the number one criticism that the DMZ is part of or at least the southern half of the DMZ is part of the Republic of Korea. So if I have relatives who in the distant past lived up in that area, I would like to be able to go into the DMZ unfettered and at certain times of the year pay homage to the remains of my ancestors. That criticism comes up from time to time. Unfortunately, my interpretation, the DMZ is not part of the Republic of Korea or the DPRK. It is a separate military area. someday the southern half will be. And when that time comes, then that access can be granted. But right now, you can't go in there to do that. Doing other things in the DMZ, when Roh Moo-hyun was the president, there was a suggestion to build a planetarium in the DMZ.
In the DMZ, okay.
Great place for a planetarium.
Sure.
I mean, you don't have any light pollution.
Yeah,
it would have been great. But is that something that could be accepted by both sides? Would both sides think that the other side wasn't spying on them?
Right.
So there are some difficulties. There are even some suggestions periodically that some UN agencies who are affiliated with activities here in the Republic of Korea should have their offices up in the DMZ and close to the military demarcation line.
Like a World Food Program or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's difficulty with that.
Yeah.
And think about it, from a practical standpoint. There aren't a lot of roads that go up into the DMZ.
Yeah.
There aren't the communications that go up in there. So if you're a UN employee, you're kind of sitting there by yourself in a tent almost. It just doesn't work.
In 2015, Park Tae-gyun, a professor of Korean studies at Seoul National University, he gave an interview in which he said that the armistice agreement was still valid but not functioning as it was intended. He said that there were fundamental structural problems, pointing, for example, to the fact that no maritime border was agreed upon and the fact that more and better weapons than those available in 1953 have been brought in by both sides. And I'm just giving two examples. I'm sure he mentioned others. Do you agree with that assessment that there are structural problems to the armistice agreement and it is not functioning as intended?
In the purest sense of definition, it would be hard to argue with that. However, again, we go back to our discussion earlier.
Yeah.
Armistice agreement wasn't intended to last 70 years.
Yeah.
So therein lies the issue. It's not that there are problems with the armistice agreement because paragraph 62 says you can amend the armistice agreement.
By mutual agreement.
By mutual agreement. So if there are things that we want to change, we can do that, but we don't. We can't get that mutual agreement. We can't get both sides to sit at the table right now anyway. But that doesn't mean that the door is closed completely. The same thing applies with the weapon systems.
Yep.
The armistice agreement allows for replacement. Well, nobody's going to fly B-17s for forever. So I think you have to, from a practical standpoint, look at some cases where the weaponry is something that should be allowed. Although, again, it all ought to be settled at the conference table and not by just either side saying, yes, we're going to do this.
When the U.S. brought nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s, which were ultimately removed in the 1990s under George H.W. Bush, was that a violation of the armistice agreement?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I'd never thought of that.
Because I think North Korea complained that it was a violation. I could see where they're coming from.
Right. I think having long-range artillery, you could make a case for it.
And as I touched on before, the fact that the UNC is actually, it's the UN in name, but it's run by the US, that's also a common criticism that UNCMAC is a body in UN name only, but it's really an agent of the American military.
Well, that kind of takes follows the North Korean argument. When you take a look at the UN and the funding for all UN programs, all UN programs aren't funded fully. So to ask for the United Nations Command to be funded by the UN may be just a bridge too far within the UN. The UN may be perfectly content with the United States of America footing the bill for it, or the other countries for that matter who send troops over here because they help pay for their troops that are here also.
Is the U.S. an obstacle standing in the way of Korean unification?
I don't think so. I think the U.S. in supporting the UN command and Panmunjom as a location for dialogue has tried to promote that as much as possible.
Promote unification or dialogue?
Well, promote dialogue, which could eventually lead to I mean, I don't think it's hard to argue that unification is a bad thing. But unification means that the parties that would reunite have to agree to that. And when we look at the polls, that varies time to time. And we go along, the younger generations in Korea don't seem to be quite as willing to want to go down that path.
Sometimes I hear some people in South Korea say that the U.S. is actually opposed politically to Korean unification. Do you think that's true?
I don't think so. I've never heard that.
Since Kim Il-sung first mentioned it in his New Year's speech of 1990, North Korea has accused South Korea and its ally, the United States, of building a giant concrete wall on the southern side of the demilitarized zone, forever solidifying the division between the two Koreas. Now, from Whitehorse Hill in Choron County, it does appear that there's some kind of horizontal concrete structure visible near the demilitarized zone. What is it, and why is it there?
There is an obstacle to prevent tanks or other heavy equipment from coming to the south. It's there for operational reasons.
Does it stretch all the way across the Korean Peninsula?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, but you haven't seen anything on maps or on satellite photographs that seems to stretch all the way across the whole demilitarized zone?
No, I don't think it's in the demilitarized zone. I think the what they're complaining about is something that was an obstacle that was in place just outside the demilitarized zone.
It may be. I do remember on my last trip to North Korea in 2019, they took us to a mountaintop from which you could see something that looked to be a concrete wall-like structure, and they gave us a long lecture about that. And I feel like it almost took half a day. I mean, they really put a lot of time in taking us up there, giving us a briefing, and showing us and saying, this is a dreadful thing that the Americans and the South Koreans have done to permanently solidify, the division of Korea.
It's there for defensive purposes. I think that if the two sides could reach some degree of rapprochement, I think those kinds of things are the things that could go away, just like the guard posts in the DMZ.
Well, and that leads me to, in 2018, then President of South Korea Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed this comprehensive military agreement. Tell us about your impressions of that agreement and how it fit within the context of the existing armistice agreement.
Like all agreements, there is good points and bad points. There are parts of the CMA, the consolidated, military agreement, that are obviously derived from the spirit of the armistice agreement. Specific point in case that the soldiers in the joint security area up in Pyongyang would not carry weapons. This takes us back to the way things were before the 18th of August of 1976.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing.
Okay.
On the negative side, you might point out to say that there are some restrictions that have been made operationally. For example, some of the no-fly zones that were created.
Is it within or outside the demilitarized zone?
It's outside the demilitarized zone, but if you're a military operator and you were flying a helicopter or a drone before, and now you can't fly in that particular area, then obviously there are some concerns about that.
Got it.
But I think it's a balanced account. It tried to do the best it could with what it had.
Is this, you mentioned a few minutes ago that there's a paragraph in the Armistice Agreement, 62 maybe, that allows for amendments to the agreement by mutual consent. Does the CMA fall under that? Is that what the CMA is?
No. We maintain at least 27 subsequent agreements to the Armistice Agreement. For example, I earlier had mentioned that there's a subsequent agreement that, now I forgot what it was about. But for example, the buildings in Pyongyang.
Yes.
How that would all be arranged was a separate agreement that was done after the Armistice Agreement, and it was done under the Armistice Agreement.
Okay, but the CMA is not under the Armistice. Is it alongside, parallel to the Armistice Agreement?
Well, the CMA is a bilateral agreement between Iraq and the DPRK, so it's not any different from the 1972 or 1991 or 2000. Agreement, really, although it's focused primarily on military matters. But there are some things in the CMA that are repetitious. For example, it mentioned the Joint Military Commission being used to resolve differences, and that has been in inter-Korean agreements in the past. But the two sides have not been able to agree on establishing the JMC.
Right.
That's the sticking point. That's the point that needs emphasis.
So it's not the making of agreements, but the enacting of the agreement.
Exactly.
Have you been keeping up with the news about the DMZ and the NLL since you retired in 2020?
I try to, yes.
How do you see recent allegations of violations and enforcement of the armistice agreement after the signing of the 2018 CMA?
I guess there has, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been as many violations, not the kind of violations that we would see before that agreement. For example, some of the shooting that took place in the DMZ, we don't see that. On the other hand, all the missile launches that have been taking place, that's something that when it's been occurring, although you could put it under the category of neither side should take hostile actions against the other side, well, it's not really a hostile action against our side if you're firing a short-range missile from Wonsan and killing fish out in the EC.
Into your own, yeah.
So it's difficult. But does it contribute? Does the CMA contribute to the maybe things getting better? Maybe. COVID did too, because everybody went inside.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's something valid to be said for that too. It would have been nice if under the CMA that some of the guard posts that were supposed to, the next iteration of removing guard posts from within the DMZ, if that had taken place.
They only went to the first step.
They only did the first iteration and stopped.
And there was supposed to be more.
There was supposed to be more. And, ultimately, the thought process was, hey, we'll take them all out, which is paragraph, I'm going to say 13A.
Yes.
But it's in the armistice agreement to remove all the entanglements and barricades. So, it's within the spirit of the armistice agreement. So, yes, we'd like to see that. Well,
yeah. The couple of weeks ago, North Korea, the North Korean Air Force flew a large number of sorties, I want to say 180, very close to the demilitarized zone. Was that something that they shouldn't have done under the CMA, where it was a no-fly zone?
I don't know. I know that they crossed that tactical action line, the TAL, but it's almost impossible in some of their cases to operationally not cross the TAL. But the TAL is in North Korea. It's north of the demilitarized zone also. But it's a tripwire, so that if the military on this side sees aircraft cross that particular line, then you say, oh, wait a minute, we need to take action.
Is there a TAL on this side too?
Well, the TAL was established by the military on this side observing North Korea.
They may or may not have one looking at this side.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so if the South Korean Air Force or U.S. Air Force crosses some line that we're not aware of, they may scramble their jets.
Right, and I don't think, I don't know for sure, but I think there's a question as to, how much they can really see with what our aircraft are doing.
Is the CMA holding?
In certain areas it is. In Panmunjom, if you go to Panmunjom, there's the soldiers there still aren't carrying weapons.
Are they walking around?
Well, that's the other thing. That COVID has prevented them from walking around too.
Right,
so, yeah.
Do you think North or South Korea will, or both, will declare the CMA null and void and we're back to where we were before, 2018?
I don't think North Korea will. They will set that trap, I think, to try to get somebody on this side to do that. You've probably read the same articles I have recently that there are arguments for why President Yoon should not do that. My personal opinion is that makes all the sense in the world, that he should not abrogate the CMA. When it's violated by the other side, he needs to call the attention. Yeah.
Okay, so leave it as it is. Last section here, looking at the future, doing away with the armistice. How can the armistice be ended, superseded, or no longer necessary?
Well, but the end, and I've got paragraph 62 in front of me, talks about articles and paragraphs of this armistice agreement shall remain in effect until expressly superseded either by mutually acceptable amendments and additions or by provision of an appropriate agreement for a peaceful settlement at the political level between both sides.
Which, because as we said very early on, the armistice agreement is an agreement between militaries, one of which we no longer know how to contact. That's the Chinese People's Volunteers. They don't have an email address or a PO box.
All right.
So that it's not even important, because it could simply be North and South Korea at the political level saying, here we have a solution, and that would then supersede or do away with the armistice agreement. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, I think you would probably, I would think that it would need an endorsement by the UNC, and I would think that the international community would also have to endorse that. It's like the end of war declaration that President Moon had suggested.
Yeah.
I think it needs some work, but that alone will not do away with the armistice agreement.
Okay, so if the two Koreas wanted to put an end to the demilitarized zone and settle a border or unite somehow, what would they need to do to get that endorsement, that buy-in?
Well, I think you need that peace agreement.
Okay.
I should say a peace regime, because there's more to it than just a piece of paper that says, yes, we both agree. The peace regime would also entail monitoring for some period of time to make sure that the provisions within that peace agreement are being upheld before one would declare that it's final.
Now, is it possible that U.S. political leadership at such a time, for political reasons, could decide to slow walk or be an obstacle to that?
I guess anything's possible, but I couldn't speculate on that. I have no idea.
Mm-hmm. Would U.S. policy towards Korea in general, or North Korea in particular, be any impediment to the two Koreas deciding to call an end to the war?
I don't think so. I think what we saw in the discussions with the end of war declaration showed that there is a concern to have that kind of a vehicle in place, but it required more discussion on both sides. Discussion on one side first, and then to get the opposing parties together after that.
And now you were there. You were working for UNCMAC in 2003 when there was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Armistice Agreement, and also in 2013 when there was the 60th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement. How were those anniversaries commemorated?
Well, in 2003, it was a massive commemoration. On that day, and it poured rain down that day. I'll never forget it.
That is July, yeah.
We had 2,500 people in Panmunjom.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. The area, you've been to Panmunjom, the area behind Freedom House, that large paved area, all of that had been covered with tents.
Wow.
And there were chairs. And there was representatives from all of the countries that had participated in the Korean War.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark.
Helen Clark, yeah.
She gave a speech that day. Henry Kissinger was there to represent the United States.
Wow.
And he gave a speech later on that day on Yongsan at 10 o'clock at night to signify that the guns had gone silent.
Wow.
And Baek Sun-yup, the
yeah.
legend, was up there too. So it was the 50th was a big deal. I can't say I recall very much from 2013.
Right.
But yeah, the 50th obviously was quite the thing. And had you been on Yongsan that evening too, they put out that small cannon or battery that they used for ceremonial purposes, and they fired a salute, 21 gun salute or whatever it was. Yeah. And exactly at 10 o'clock at night, the last round was fired, and all the lights went out.
Whoa.
And it was intended to be that way. And not a word was said after that. That was the end of the ceremony. But it was such a poignant thing. It was amazing.
Now, next year, 2023, we'll see the 70th anniversary of the signing of the armistice, which, as you pointed out a couple of times, wasn't supposed to last more than a year at best. What do you expect to see in terms of commemoration activities?
Well, that's really hard to say. I think the most difficult thing is, if we go back to 2003, 20 years ago, those veterans that took place in the Korean War were in their 70s, maybe some in their 80s. Now most are in their 80s and 90s. So it becomes more difficult. The Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs brings those people back on those annual trips, which is a wonderful thing.
Right.
But it's difficult for them to travel for such an activity too. I would like to see, personally, I'd like to see some sort of a commemoration up in Panmunjom. Back in the days long before my time at UNCMAC, there was always offers to the North to send a delegation over to participate, because these weren't victory celebrations. This was a commemoration of the signing of the armistice, and asked the North to participate again. We've done those in the past, made those offers, but they haven't come over to do it.
Of course, North Korea, I think, sees it as a victory. They call it Victory Day.
Yeah, it's victory of the War of the Fatherland, right. Yes.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show today, John Burzynski. It's been a great pleasure talking to you and learning a lot more about the armistice.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope that we educate people on more about what the armistice is.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of talk. We weren't able to talk about the Kaesong Industrial Complex or Kumgangsan or transportation corridors, separated families, defections by U.S. military to North Korea. There's a lot of things. So hopefully we'll have you back again next year if we're able to.
Okay, I'd be glad to come back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of today's podcast. If you already have an NK News subscription, please take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access at membership@nknews.org today. Also, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, go to Brian Betts and Arius Dare for facilitating this episode, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius who cuts out all the bathroom breaks and drinking noises, etc. Thank you very much, Gabby. Listen again next time.